Uncle Mark stood over Grandma Dorothy's casket with tears in his eyes, but when he turned to me and whispered, "Don't worry, honey, we'll take care of everything now," I knew those tears weren't from grief. 3 hours later, while everyone was still eating potato salad in the church basement, he handed me an envelope with $500 cash and said, "This should cover your expenses for a while." That's when I realized I wasn't just losing my grandmother, I was losing my entire life. But what Mark didn't know was that Dorothy had spent her final weeks planning something that would change everything, and in exactly 72 hours, a quiet man with wire-rimmed glasses would knock on my door carrying papers that would make Mark's confident smirk disappear forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Dorothy Mitchell died on a Tuesday morning in October, slipping away peacefully in her sleep at 89 years old, just like she always said she wanted. I found her when I came downstairs to make her morning coffee, something I'd done every day for the past 3 years since I'd moved into the Victorian house on Maple Street to take care of her. She looked serene, her silver hair spread across the pillow, her hands folded neatly over the quilt she'd sewn herself 40 years ago. For a moment, I just stood in the doorway, knowing that this was the last time I'd see her face without the weight of funeral preparations and family politics crushing down on everything we'd built together. I called the paramedics first, then sat beside her bed holding her hand while we waited, telling her about the book I'd been reading to her the night before, even though I knew she couldn't hear me anymore. The house felt different already, like it was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. When the EMTs arrived and confirmed what I already knew, they were gentle and respectful, asking if I needed a moment before they called the coroner. I nodded and kissed Dorothy's forehead, whispering, "Thank you for everything, Grandma," because she'd been more than a grandmother to me. She'd been my anchor after Dad died, my sanctuary when the world felt too overwhelming, and my best friend through 3 years of quiet mornings and long conversations about everything from local politics to her memories of teaching half the town's parents when they were children. The second call I made was to Uncle Mark, Dorothy's eldest son, who lived 20 minutes away in the newer subdivision, but hadn't visited more than twice in the past year. When I told him Dorothy had passed, there was a pause that lasted too long, followed by what sounded like muffled conversation in the background before he said, "We'll be right over." His voice carried a strange tone, not quite grief, but something sharper, more focused, like a businessman who'd just received important news about a deal. I didn't think much of it at the time, because shock affects people differently, and I was still processing my own loss, still trying to understand that the woman who'd raised me after my father's death was really gone. Mark and Linda arrived within 30 minutes, pulling into the driveway in their silver BMW, and I watched from the living room window as they sat in the car for several minutes before getting out. Linda was checking her phone while Mark appeared to be making notes on a small pad he kept in his jacket pocket. When they finally came to the door, Linda hugged me with the kind of embrace that feels rehearsed, and Mark patted my shoulder while scanning the room behind me like he was taking inventory. They asked the appropriate questions about Dorothy's final moments, nodded sympathetically when I described finding her, but I noticed they exchanged glances whenever I mentioned something about the house or Dorothy's belongings. The funeral arrangements happened quickly, perhaps too quickly in retrospect. Mark immediately took charge, saying he knew which funeral home Dorothy would have preferred and that he'd handle all the details, since I was too emotional to make these kinds of decisions right now. Linda chimed in with suggestions about keeping the service simple and affordable, mentioning multiple times how expensive funerals could be and how Dorothy wouldn't have wanted us to go into debt for her sake. When I offered to help pay for arrangements using the savings Dorothy had helped me accumulate over the years, Mark waved me off and said, "Don't worry about money right now, sweetheart. Family takes care of family." That phrase would echo in my mind for days afterward, especially when Tyler and Ashley arrived that evening to help with preparations. Tyler, Mark's 28-year-old son, immediately started asking about Dorothy's property boundaries and whether she'd ever mentioned updating her survey markers. Ashley, 2 years younger and always absorbed in her phone, made several comments about how much the house was probably worth and how lucky whoever inherited it would be to have such a prime location in the historic district. Their casual discussions about Dorothy's assets while her body was still in the house felt wrong, but I attributed it to different ways of processing grief and tried to focus on honoring Dorothy's memory rather than questioning their motives. The funeral service was held on Friday at Peaceful Rest Funeral Chapel, the same place where we'd said goodbye to my father 3 years earlier. Dorothy had been a beloved figure in Riverside, having served as elementary school principal for nearly 4 decades, and the chapel was packed with former students, fellow teachers, and community members whose lives she'd touched. I sat in the front row, wearing the black dress Dorothy had helped me pick out for job interviews, listening to speaker after speaker share stories about her kindness, her dedication to education, and her quiet generosity toward families in need. Mark delivered the main eulogy, speaking eloquently about Dorothy's legacy and her commitment to family values. He talked about growing up with a mother who demanded excellence, who taught him the importance of hard work and responsibility, and who always put her children's welfare first. The words sounded beautiful, but they felt hollow, coming from someone who'd barely visited her in her final years, who'd missed her last 3 birthdays because of work commitments, and who'd never once offered to help with her care despite living in the same town. After the service, as we gathered in the church basement for the traditional meal, I noticed Mark and Linda having whispered conversations with various family members and community leaders. They seemed preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I'm particularly interested in talking to Dorothy's former colleagues and neighbors, asking questions about her recent activities, and whether she'd mentioned any changes to her living situation or financial arrangements. At the time, I thought they were simply trying to piece together Dorothy's final months, but their questions felt oddly specific, focused more on practical matters than emotional memories. That's when Mark approached me with the envelope of cash. We were standing near the dessert table, surrounded by the comfortable chatter of people sharing Dorothy's stories, when he pulled me aside and handed me the white envelope with my name written on it in his careful handwriting. "Dorothy would want you to have this," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "It should help with your transition." When I opened it and saw the 5 crisp $100 bills, my stomach dropped. $500 felt like a tip, like payment for services rendered, rather than recognition of my relationship with Dorothy, or acknowledgement of the 3 years I'd spent caring for her. "Transition to what?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, despite the growing unease in my chest. Mark's expression shifted slightly, the sympathetic mask slipping just enough to reveal something calculating underneath. "Well, you'll need to find your own place now," he said matter-of-factly. "The house has been in the Mitchell family for generations, and Linda and I will need to handle Dorothy's estate according to her wishes. She always talked about keeping family property in the family line." The basement suddenly felt too warm, too crowded, too loud. I stared at Mark, trying to process what he was saying while the reality of my situation began to crystallize. Dorothy had never mentioned anything about me needing to move out after her death. In fact, she'd often talked about how glad she was that I'd made the house my home, how it felt alive again with young energy, how she hoped I'd stay as long as I needed to build my life in Riverside. We'd discussed my future plans, my job at the library, my dreams of eventually going back to school, all within the context of me remaining in the house where I'd found stability and purpose. But Grandma never said anything about me leaving, I managed to say, aware that my voice was attracting attention from nearby conversations. She told me I could stay as long as I needed. This has been my home for 3 years. Mark's expression became more formal, more distant, like he was delivering news he'd rehearsed. "Dorothy was getting older, Sarah. Sometimes elderly people say things without fully considering the legal implications or the impact on other family members. The important thing is that we honor her true wishes, which were always about preserving family legacy for future generations." Linda appeared beside Mark as if summoned, carrying 2 plates of food and wearing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sarah, honey, we know this is difficult," she said, setting the plates down and placing a manicured hand on my arm. "But Mark and I have been talking with our attorney, and we want to make sure everything is handled properly according to Ohio inheritance law. Dorothy's estate will need to go through probate, and during that process, it's better if the property remains unoccupied to avoid any complications." The word unoccupied hit me like a physical blow. They weren't just asking me to move out eventually, they wanted me gone immediately. The house where I'd cared for Dorothy through her final illness, where I'd made her meals and read her books and held her hand during difficult nights, where I'd built the first real home I'd known since my father's death, was being reclaimed before Dorothy was even in the ground. I looked around the basement at the familiar faces of people who'd known Dorothy for decades, wondering if any of them understood what was happening, if any of them would speak up for the granddaughter who'd devoted 3 years to making sure Dorothy never felt alone or forgotten. Tyler appeared at my elbow, his construction worker hands holding a cup of coffee and a piece of chocolate cake. "Don't worry, Sarah," he said with what I think he meant as reassurance. "Mom and Dad will help you find an apartment in town. Maybe something above Murphy's bookstore, or near the library where you work. It'll be good for you to have your own space, start fresh." His casual assumption that I'd be grateful for their help in relocating from the only home I'd known since college made me realize how thoroughly they'd planned this conversation, how completely they'd already decided my fate. Ashley joined our small circle, having apparently finished whatever social media post she'd been composing during the funeral meal. "Actually, Sarah, I was thinking you might want to consider moving to a bigger city," she said brightly. "I mean, what's really keeping you in Riverside? You're young, you're smart, you could probably find a way better job somewhere with more opportunities. Sometimes a loss like this is actually a chance for a fresh start, Her suggestion was delivered with such cheerful optimism that it took me a moment to recognize it as encouragement to leave town entirely, to remove myself not just from Dorothy's house but from Riverside altogether. I excused myself and walked outside, needing air and space to think. The October afternoon was crisp and clear, the kind of weather Dorothy had always loved, because it reminded her of new school years and fresh beginnings. I stood beside my car, the same reliable Honda Civic Dorothy had helped me buy when I'd moved to Riverside, and tried to understand how my life had changed so completely in the span of a few hours. That morning, I'd been Dorothy's granddaughter, living in the family home, surrounded by memories and belongings that connected me to generations of Mitchells. Now I was apparently a guest who'd overstayed her welcome, someone who needed to be relocated and possibly encouraged to leave town for everyone's convenience. The $500 felt heavy in my purse, and I realized it wasn't just money. It was a severance package, a polite way of ending my connection to Dorothy's life and legacy. Mark and Linda had managed to transform my grief into gratitude for their generosity, my home into their burden, and my future into their problem to solve. They'd done it smoothly, professionally, with just enough concern for my feelings to avoid seeming cruel while making their intentions perfectly clear. As I drove back to Maple Street that evening, I wondered if Dorothy had known this would happen. Had she been aware that her eldest son viewed her property as his inheritance, that her daughter-in-law was already calculating the house's market value, that her grandchildren saw her death as an opportunity rather than a loss? Had she chosen not to tell me because she wanted my final years with her to be peaceful, unmarred by family politics and inheritance disputes? Or had she trusted that her family would honor the relationship we'd built, the home we'd shared, the understanding that seemed so clear between us? The house felt enormous and empty when I unlocked the front door. Dorothy's presence was everywhere, in the knitting basket beside her favorite chair, in the reading glasses still sitting on the kitchen table, in the half-finished crossword puzzle folded next to the morning paper I hadn't had the heart to clear away. I walked through the rooms slowly, touching familiar objects and remembering conversations we'd had about their history, their significance, their stories. This wasn't just a house to me. It was a repository of family memory, a place where Dorothy had chosen to share her life with someone who'd needed both shelter and belonging. I made myself a cup of tea using Dorothy's favorite mug and sat at the kitchen table, where we'd shared thousands of meals and conversations. The reality of my situation was beginning to sink in. I had no legal claim to the house, no documentation of Dorothy's promises that I could stay, no written agreement that would support my understanding of our arrangement. I'd been operating on love and trust, while Mark and Linda had apparently been operating on law and precedent. The $500 was looking less like generosity and more like evidence that they'd planned this transition carefully, calculating exactly how much it would cost to remove me from their inheritance without seeming heartless. That night, I barely slept, lying in the bedroom that had become mine, staring at the ceiling and trying to imagine where I'd go, how I'd afford to start over, what I'd do with 3 years' worth of memories and belongings and connections that couldn't be packed into boxes and moved to some efficiency apartment across town. Dorothy had been more than my grandmother. She'd been my mentor, my stability, my family. Losing her was devastating enough without also losing everything else that connected me to her love and legacy. I thought about calling Mark, trying to reason with him, explaining how much the house meant to me, and asking for more time to figure out my options. But something in his tone at the funeral, the way he and Linda had exchanged looks, the careful phrasing Tyler and Ashley had used, told me this wasn't a decision they'd made lightly, or one they'd be willing to reconsider. They'd presented it as a done deal, a legal necessity, a family obligation that unfortunately required my displacement. The next morning, Saturday, I called in sick to the library and spent the day walking through Dorothy's house, trying to memorize every detail before I'd be forced to leave it behind. I found myself opening drawers and closets, looking through Dorothy's personal belongings for some clue about her true intentions, some document or letter that might explain what she'd really wanted for me and for the house. I wasn't sure what I was hoping to find, but I felt compelled to understand how the woman who'd told me I was the daughter she'd never had could have left me so completely unprotected. By Sunday evening, the weight of uncertainty and grief was becoming unbearable. I'd spent 2 days in limbo, not knowing when Mark and Linda would expect me to move out, not knowing where I'd go, not knowing if I'd misunderstood something fundamental about my relationship with Dorothy, or if I was being manipulated by family members who saw me as an obstacle to their inheritance. The house that had been my sanctuary was beginning to feel like a museum of a life I was no longer allowed to live, and every familiar object reminded me of conversations and promises that might have meant less than I'd believed. That's when I remembered Mr. Chen, Dorothy's neighbor and longtime friend who lived in the blue house next door. Robert Chen had been Dorothy's closest neighbor for over 20 years, and they'd developed the kind of friendship that transcends age and cultural differences. He was a retired postal worker who'd emigrated from Taiwan in the 1970s, and Dorothy had been one of the first neighbors to welcome him and his late wife to Riverside. They'd shared garden tips, borrowed tools, and watched out for each other through illnesses, storms, and the ordinary challenges of aging. If anyone might know Dorothy's true intentions about the house and my future, it would be Mr. Chen. I'd always liked Mr. Chen, who was unfailingly polite and had occasionally helped Dorothy with heavy lifting or minor repairs when I wasn't available. He'd attended the funeral service but hadn't stayed for the meal, slipping out quietly after paying his respects. As I stood at my kitchen window looking across at his house, I noticed lights were on and decided that talking to him might help me understand whether Dorothy had mentioned anything about her plans for the property or her concerns about my welfare after her death. I walked across the yard and knocked on Mr. Chen's front door, unsure what I was hoping to accomplish but desperate for some connection to Dorothy's actual wishes, rather than Mark and Linda's interpretation of family law. When Mr. Chen opened the door, his expression shifted from polite recognition to something more serious, almost expectant, as if he'd been waiting for this conversation. "Sarah?" he said quietly, stepping aside to invite me in. "I was wondering when you would come." Mr. Chen led me into his modest living room, where the walls were lined with photographs spanning decades of life in America and memories of Taiwan. He gestured for me to sit on his burgundy sofa while he settled into a worn recliner that clearly held years of evening reading sessions. The room smelled faintly of jasmine tea and old books, creating an atmosphere of quiet wisdom that reminded me of Dorothy's own space next door. Mr. Chen studied my face for a long moment before speaking, his expression carrying a weight I hadn't expected. "Your grandmother spoke of you often in these past months," he began, his accented English careful and precise. "She was worried about what would happen after she was gone, especially about your uncle's intentions regarding the house." The directness of his statement caught me off guard. I'd expected polite condolences and perhaps some shared memories of Dorothy, not an immediate acknowledgement of the family tensions I'd barely begun to understand myself. Mr. Chen rose and walked to a mahogany desk in the corner of the room, opening the top drawer and retrieving a manila envelope that looked official and important. 3 weeks ago, Dorothy asked me to witness something for her. She said it was important that someone she trusted understood her true wishes, in case there were questions later. He handed me the envelope, and I could see my name written across the front in Dorothy's distinctive handwriting, the same careful script she'd used to grade papers for 40 years. Inside was a letter addressed to me, dated just 1 month before Dorothy's death, along with several other documents I couldn't immediately identify. My hands trembled as I unfolded the letter, recognizing the cream-colored stationery Dorothy had always used for important correspondence. The letter began simply, "My dearest Sarah, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are probably feeling confused and hurt by your uncle's actions. I need you to know that everything I am about to tell you is true, and that I planned carefully to protect both you and my legacy." The letter continued with revelations that made my stomach turn. Dorothy had discovered, through conversations with her bank manager and attorney, that Mark had been pressuring her for months to sign documents that would transfer ownership of the house to him immediately, citing concerns about estate taxes and probate complications. He'd told her that gifting the property to him while she was still alive would save the family thousands of dollars and ensure that her wishes were carried out without legal challenges. Dorothy had refused, but Mark's persistence had alarmed her enough that she'd quietly consulted with a different attorney, one Mark didn't know about, to understand her options and protect my interests. What she'd learned had shocked her. Mark had already begun telling people in town that he would be inheriting the house, had inquired about its market value with 3 different real estate agents, and had even met with contractors about potential renovations that would increase its resale potential. I realized, Dorothy's letter continued, that Mark saw my death not as a loss but as a business opportunity. He was planning to sell the house immediately after my funeral, regardless of any promises I'd made to you or any understanding we'd reached about your future here. That's when I decided to take action to ensure that my real wishes would be honored, not the ones Mark assumes I have. Mr. Chen watched me read, occasionally nodding as if he could see my face reflecting the contents of the letter. When I reached the part about Mark's meetings with contractors, my hands clenched involuntarily around the paper. Dorothy had been planning for months to protect me from something she saw coming, while I'd been blissfully unaware that my future was being negotiated behind my back by people who viewed me as an inconvenience rather than family. The letter revealed that Dorothy had indeed revised her will, but not in the way Mark expected. Instead of leaving the house to her eldest son, she'd created a life estate arrangement that would allow me to live in the house for as long as I wanted, with full ownership transferring to me after a period of 10 years. The arrangement included provisions for property taxes, maintenance, and utilities, ensuring that I wouldn't be burdened with expenses I couldn't afford on my library salary. But Dorothy had gone further than just protecting my housing. She'd also established that if anyone attempted to challenge the will or pressure me to leave the house, the entire estate would immediately transfer to the Riverside Educational Foundation, leaving Mark and his family with nothing. It was an insurance policy designed to prevent exactly the kind of manipulation I'd experienced at the funeral, and it demonstrated a level of strategic thinking I'd never suspected Dorothy possessed. She was very specific about the timing, Mr. Chen said softly as I finished reading. Dorothy knew that Mark would move quickly after her death, before you had time to understand your rights or seek legal help. She wanted you to have this information immediately, but she also wanted you to have evidence that would stand up in court if necessary. The additional documents in the envelope included copies of the new will, signed and witnessed properly, along with documentation of Mark's inquiries about the house value and his meetings with real estate agents. Dorothy had been methodically building a case against her own son's intentions, creating an undeniable record of his plans to disregard her actual wishes in favor of his financial interests. There was also a business card for Patricia Reeves, the attorney Dorothy had consulted secretly, along with a note explaining that Ms. Reeves had copies of all relevant documents and had been instructed to contact me immediately after Dorothy's funeral. The note included a phone number and the words, "Call her Monday morning. She's expecting you, and she has more information that will help you understand the full situation." I sat in Mr. Chen's living room, holding proof that Dorothy had not only anticipated Mark's betrayal, but had spent her final weeks actively working to prevent it. The $500 Mark had given me wasn't generosity. It was a payoff designed to make me feel grateful while he stole my inheritance. His concern about estate taxes and probate complications wasn't family-minded planning. It was cover for a scheme to claim property that Dorothy had explicitly intended for me. Why didn't she tell me? I asked Mr. Chen, my voice barely above a whisper. Why did she let me think everything was uncertain when she'd already arranged everything? Mr. Chen's expression grew thoughtful, and he leaned forward in his chair before answering. She said you had enough to worry about, taking care of her and managing your own life. She didn't want her final months with you to be overshadowed by family conflict and legal preparations. She wanted that time to be about love, not business. The consideration behind Dorothy's secrecy made my chest ache with a mixture of gratitude and grief. Even while she was planning to protect me from her own family, she'd been protecting me from the stress of knowing I needed protection. She'd carried the burden of Mark's greed and manipulation alone, ensuring that our final conversations could focus on memories and affection rather than wills and inheritance disputes. Mr. Chen offered me tea, and we sat together in comfortable silence while I processed the magnitude of what Dorothy had done. She hadn't just left me the house. She'd anticipated every argument Mark might make, every pressure he might apply, every legal maneuver he might attempt. She'd created a fortress of documentation around her true intentions, making it impossible for anyone to claim she'd been confused, manipulated, or acting against her family's best interests. As the evening grew darker, Mr. Chen shared more details about Dorothy's final weeks. She'd asked him to be available as a witness to her mental clarity and decision-making capacity, knowing that Mark might later claim she'd been suffering from dementia or undue influence. She'd made sure her attorney had medical records confirming her cognitive health, and she'd even arranged for her longtime physician to provide a written statement about her mental acuity right up until her final days. Your grandmother was a teacher for 40 years, Mr. Chen reminded me. She knew how to plan for every possible question, every challenge a student might raise. She approached this the same way, thinking through every argument Mark might make and preparing answers in advance. When I finally returned to the house on Maple Street that night, everything looked different. The furniture, the photographs, the books, the carefully tended plants. They weren't just remnants of Dorothy's life anymore. They were evidence of her love, proof of her intention, that this space should continue to be my home. The uncertainty that had plagued me since the funeral was replaced by a different kind of anticipation, a sense that Monday morning would bring not just answers, but justice. I called Patricia Reeves first thing Monday morning, and her secretary scheduled me for an appointment that afternoon. Ms. Oa, Reeves turned out to be a woman in her mid-50s with steel gray hair, and the kind of direct manner that suggested she'd handled many family inheritance disputes. Her office was lined with law books and family photographs, creating an atmosphere of both professional competence and personal warmth. Dorothy spoke about you often, Ms. Reeves said as I settled into the chair across from her desk. She was very clear about her intentions and very concerned about potential challenges from her eldest son. She wanted to make sure you understood not just what she'd left you, but why she'd structured things the way she had. Ms. Reeves opened a thick file and began explaining the legal framework Dorothy had created. The life estate arrangement was specifically designed to protect me from being forced out of the house, while also ensuring that Mark couldn't claim the property had been gifted to me improperly. The 10-year timeline was calculated to satisfy tax requirements while giving me security and stability to build my future. But the most important element was the penalty clause Dorothy had included. If anyone attempted to challenge the will, threaten me, or interfere with my occupancy of the house, they would forfeit all claims to Dorothy's estate. The provision was legally binding and had been carefully worded to withstand court challenges. Mark's pressure tactics at the funeral, his assumption that he could simply move me out, and his apparent plans to sell the house immediately would all be viewed as violations of Dorothy's explicit instructions. She was particularly concerned about emotional manipulation, Ms. Reeves explained. Dorothy told me that Mark had a history of making family members feel guilty for asserting their rights, making them feel selfish for not going along with his plans. She wanted you to know that standing up for yourself isn't selfishness. It's honoring her wishes. Ms. Reeves also revealed that Dorothy had been tracking Mark's activities for months through mutual friends and community connections. His inquiries about the house value, his meetings with contractors, and his conversations with other family members about inheritance plans had all been documented. Dorothy had even discovered that Mark had told several people he planned to use proceeds from selling her house to fund Tyler's construction business and Ashley's social media marketing company. The attorney handed me copies of all relevant documents, including the original will that clearly stated my rights and the conditions under which they could be challenged. She also provided me with a timeline for notification requirements, explaining that Mark and Linda would need to be formally informed of the will's contents and the penalties for interfering with its execution. Dorothy wanted you to have choices, Ms. Reeves said as our meeting concluded. You can notify them immediately and assert your rights, or you can wait and see what actions they take first. Either way, you're protected, and any pressure they apply will only strengthen your legal position. As I drove home from Ms. Reeves's office, I felt a strange mixture of empowerment and sadness. Dorothy had given me everything I needed to secure my future, but she'd had to do it secretly, protecting me from her own family's greed and manipulation. The grandmother who'd taught me to bake bread and tend gardens had also taught me a final lesson about standing up to people who would take advantage of grief and trust. That evening, I called Mr. Chen to thank him for his role in Dorothy's planning and to let him know that I now understood the full scope of what she'd arranged. He seemed relieved that the information had reached me safely and that I had legal support to navigate whatever challenges might come next. She loved you very much, he said before we ended our conversation. Everything she did was to make sure that love would be honored, not forgotten. The next morning, Tuesday, I woke up in my bedroom in Dorothy's house, my house, with a clarity I hadn't felt since before the funeral. I made coffee in the kitchen, where Dorothy and I had shared so many conversations, and I began planning how to handle Mark and Linda's inevitable reaction when they learned that their assumptions about inheritance had been completely wrong. I decided to give them one more day to reveal their true intentions before I disclosed what I knew. If they approached me with respect and honesty about Dorothy's actual will, I would respond in kind. But if they continued to pressure me to leave, continued to treat me like an obstacle to their financial plans, then they would learn exactly how thoroughly Dorothy had anticipated and prevented their schemes. Wednesday afternoon, Mark called and asked if he could stop by to discuss practical matters regarding the house and my living situation. His tone was businesslike but not unkind, and I agreed to meet with him that evening. I spent the afternoon organizing Dorothy's documents and my own thoughts, preparing for a conversation that would either restore family relationships or make clear why Dorothy had felt the need to protect me from them. When Mark arrived at 7 o'clock, he was alone, which surprised me. Linda's absence suggested this might be a more personal conversation than the formal family meeting I'd expected. Mark looked tired and somewhat uncomfortable as he sat in Dorothy's living room, and for a moment I felt a flash of sympathy for him. Losing a parent is difficult regardless of family dynamics, and I wondered if his focus on practical matters was simply his way of coping with grief. "Sarah," he began, "I know the past few days have been overwhelming, and I want you to know that Linda and I understand how attached you are to this house. We're not trying to be cruel or unreasonable." His words carried a tone of gentle authority, as if he were preparing to deliver news that might be disappointing but was ultimately for my own good. He continued by explaining that he'd spoken with his attorney about the best way to handle Dorothy's estate, emphasizing the importance of following proper legal procedures and avoiding any complications that might arise from informal arrangements. "The thing is," he said, leaning forward earnestly, "even if Mom made some promises about you staying here, those promises can't override standard inheritance law or the responsibilities that come with estate administration." Mark's explanation was delivered with what seemed like genuine concern for my welfare, but his assumptions about Dorothy's promises revealed that he still had no idea what she'd actually arranged. He talked about the house as if it were clearly his inheritance, as if my occupancy were a temporary favor that would need to end once proper legal procedures were followed. "I want to be fair to you," Mark concluded, "so I'm prepared to give you 60 days to find other housing. That should be plenty of time to locate an apartment and arrange for moving assistance. Linda and I can even help with security deposits or other expenses if needed." His offer was presented as generosity, but the underlying message was clear. My time in Dorothy's house was ending whether I agreed or not. Mark had decided that 60 days was a reasonable compromise between his desire to claim his inheritance and his obligation to avoid seeming heartless toward his grieving niece. I listened to his entire presentation without interrupting, watching his face and body language for signs of the deception Dorothy had warned me about. Mark seemed sincere in his belief that he was being reasonable and considerate, which made me realize that he'd probably convinced himself that Dorothy's real wishes aligned with his own financial interests. When he finished speaking, I thanked him for his concern and asked if he had any documentation of his authority to make decisions about the house. The question seemed to catch him off guard, and he shifted uncomfortably in his chair before explaining that while the will hadn't been formally read yet, standard inheritance law meant that as Dorothy's eldest son, he was the natural heir to her primary asset. "Have you actually seen the will, Uncle Mark?" I asked quietly, and his expression shifted from confidence to something more guarded. He admitted that he hadn't seen the document itself, but that his attorney had assured him that in the absence of specific instructions otherwise, primary heirs were typically the deceased's children, with assets distributed according to standard legal formulas. That's when I realized that Mark's assumptions about inheritance weren't based on any actual knowledge of Dorothy's wishes, but on legal generalizations and his own expectations about family hierarchy. He'd built his plans around what he thought should happen, not what Dorothy had actually arranged to happen. I stood up and walked to Dorothy's desk, retrieving the copies of legal documents Ms. Reeves had given me. "I think there are some things you should know about Grandma's actual will," I said, returning to my seat with the papers in hand. Mark's confident posture began to change as he realized I had information he'd been operating without. "Dorothy left very specific instructions about the house and about my future here," I continued, watching Mark's face carefully as I spoke. "She also left very specific instructions about what would happen if anyone tried to pressure me to leave or challenged her actual wishes." The color began to drain from Mark's face as the implications of my words became clear. For the first time since Dorothy's death, I saw uncertainty in his expression, a recognition that his assumptions might be fundamentally wrong. I handed him the copy of Dorothy's will, watching as he read the sections that clearly outlined my life estate rights and the penalty clauses that would activate if anyone interfered with Dorothy's intentions. His hands began to shake slightly as he absorbed the reality that everything he'd planned, everything he'd assumed, everything he'd told Linda and Tyler and Ashley about their inheritance was based on complete misunderstanding of what Dorothy had actually wanted. "This can't be right," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mom wouldn't have done this without telling me. We talked about the house, about keeping it in the family. She knew how important it was to preserve family assets for future generations." I could see him trying to reconcile his conversations with Dorothy, with the legal document in his hands, searching for some explanation that would make sense of the disconnect between his expectations and reality. But the will was clear, specific, and legally binding, leaving no room for interpretation or negotiation. "She did keep it in the family, Uncle Mark," I said gently. "She kept it for the family member who'd been taking care of her, who'd made it their home, who'd shown through actions rather than words that they valued her presence more than her possessions." Mark set the papers down and stared at the floor for several long minutes. When he finally looked up, his expression had changed completely. The confident authority was gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine shock and the beginning of understanding about how thoroughly he'd misjudged both Dorothy's intentions and his own position in her affections. The conversation that followed was painful but necessary, as Mark began to realize that his plans to sell the house, fund Tyler's business, and provide Ashley with rental income had been built on assumptions that Dorothy had explicitly rejected. She hadn't just chosen to protect me, she'd chosen to prevent the very outcomes Mark had been working toward. As Mark prepared to leave that evening, he looked around Dorothy's living room with what seemed like new eyes, perhaps recognizing for the first time how completely I'd integrated into the space, how naturally I belonged among Dorothy's belongings and memories. The house wasn't just a financial asset to me. It was home in a way it might never have been for someone planning to sell it immediately. "I need to talk to Linda," he said quietly, gathering his coat and keys. "We need to understand what this means for everyone involved." After he left, I sat in Dorothy's chair, holding the legal documents that guaranteed my security, and thinking about the grandmother who'd loved me enough to anticipate this exact conversation, this exact moment when truth would finally confront assumption. Dorothy had given me more than a house. She'd given me the power to honor her actual wishes, rather than her family's interpretation of what those wishes should have been. The call came at 6:30 the next morning, jolting me awake with its sharp persistence. Linda's voice was tight with barely controlled fury when I answered, dispensing with any pretense of pleasantries or family concern. "We need to talk immediately," she said, her words clipped and precise. "Mark told me about your conversation last night, and there are serious questions about the validity of these documents you've produced. I'm coming over in an hour, and I'm bringing our attorney." I sat up in bed, instantly alert despite the early hour, recognizing that Linda's aggressive tone marked the beginning of a new phase in this family conflict. The shocked acceptance Mark had shown the previous evening had apparently transformed overnight into something more combative, and Linda's background in banking meant she would approach this situation with the kind of systematic analysis that could be more dangerous than Mark's emotional assumptions. Linda arrived precisely 1 hour later, accompanied by a tall man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as Jonathan Hartley, partner at Hartley, Morrison & Associates. Their coordinated appearance and formal demeanor suggested they'd spent considerable time preparing for this confrontation, and Linda's professional attire gave her the appearance of someone conducting a business meeting, rather than a family discussion. "Sarah," Linda began without preamble, settling herself at Dorothy's dining room table and opening a leather portfolio. "We've reviewed the documents Mark showed us last night, and several red flags have emerged that suggest these papers may not reflect Dorothy's true intentions or mental state during her final weeks." Mr. Hartley nodded gravely and removed his own folder from a briefcase that looked like it cost more than my monthly salary. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, addressing me with formal courtesy that felt calculated rather than respectful. "Inheritance disputes involving elderly individuals often reveal evidence of undue influence, coercion, or diminished cognitive capacity that invalidates seemingly legitimate legal documents." Linda leaned forward, her expression combining sympathetic concern with professional skepticism. "We know you care deeply for Dorothy, and we understand that she may have made promises during emotional moments that she didn't fully think through. But our research suggests that this will was executed under circumstances that raise serious questions about whether Dorothy was truly capable of making such significant decisions without proper family consultation." The implications of their coordinated presentation became clear immediately. They weren't just challenging the will's validity, they were suggesting that I had somehow manipulated an elderly woman into changing her estate plans to benefit me unfairly. Linda's banking background had apparently taught her how to frame financial irregularities as evidence of elder abuse, and Mr. Hartley's legal expertise would provide the professional authority to make such accusations credible. Mr. Hartley opened his folder and produced what appeared to be medical records and financial statements, spreading them across Dorothy's table like evidence in a criminal investigation. "We've discovered that Dorothy made several large withdrawals from her savings account during the months preceding her death, along with payments to an attorney she'd never used before. These patterns are consistent with situations where elderly individuals are being pressured to make financial decisions that don't align with their established wishes or family relationships." Linda pointed to specific entries on the bank statements, her finger tracing transactions with the precision of someone accustomed to analyzing financial irregularities. Dorothy had banked with us for over 30 years, and she'd never made secretive legal arrangements or hidden financial activity from her family. The fact that she suddenly began conducting business with unfamiliar professionals suggests she may have been influenced by someone who convinced her that secrecy was necessary. The sophistication of their attack was impressive and deeply disturbing. They'd constructed a narrative that cast Dorothy as a confused elderly woman and me as a manipulative caregiver who'd taken advantage of her vulnerability to secure an inheritance I didn't deserve. The evidence they'd gathered was circumstantial, but presented with enough professional authority to seem compelling to anyone unfamiliar with the actual circumstances. Furthermore, Mr. Hartley continued, removing additional documents from his briefcase, "We've spoken with several of Dorothy's longtime friends and neighbors, who report that she seemed increasingly anxious and secretive during her final months. These behavioral changes are consistent with someone experiencing pressure or confusion about complex legal matters beyond their full comprehension. I listened to their presentation with growing amazement at how thoroughly they'd transformed Dorothy's careful planning into evidence of victimization. The secrecy that had been Dorothy's way of protecting me from family conflict was now being portrayed as proof that she'd been manipulated. The anxiety Dorothy's friends had observed was being attributed to confusion rather than her justified concerns about Mark's intentions. Linda's expression softened into what appeared to be genuine compassion as she reached across the table toward me. "Sarah, we understand that you may not have realized the impact of your influence on Dorothy's decision-making. Elderly people can become very attached to their caregivers, and sometimes that attachment leads them to make promises or decisions that aren't in anyone's best interest. We're not accusing you of deliberate wrongdoing, but we can't ignore evidence that suggests Dorothy wasn't acting with full autonomy when she made these arrangements. The carefully constructed reasonableness of their approach was more unsettling than outright hostility would have been. They'd positioned themselves as concerned family members trying to protect Dorothy's true legacy from the unfortunate consequences of my unintentional manipulation. Their willingness to acknowledge my good intentions while questioning the validity of Dorothy's choices created a framework that made resistance seem selfish and defensive. Mr. Hartley leaned back in his chair and adopted the tone of a mediator seeking reasonable compromise. Given these concerns about the circumstances surrounding Dorothy's final legal arrangements, we believe the most appropriate course would be to return to the standard inheritance framework that Dorothy had maintained throughout her adult life. This would involve distributing her estate according to traditional family structures, while ensuring that your contributions to her care are appropriately recognized. Linda nodded and opened her portfolio to reveal what appeared to be a prepared settlement agreement. We've drafted a proposal that would provide you with $25,000 in recognition of your caregiving services, along with 60 days to locate alternative housing and assistance with moving expenses. This seems far more equitable than arrangements made under questionable circumstances, and it would avoid the expense and emotional trauma of a lengthy legal challenge. The settlement offer was presented as generosity designed to avoid conflict, but the underlying threat was unmistakable. They were prepared to challenge Dorothy's will in court, dragging me through a legal process that would be expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally devastating. The $25,000 was positioned as compensation for my services rather than inheritance, transforming my relationship with Dorothy from family to employee, and reducing 3 years of shared life to a business transaction. I asked to see the evidence they'd gathered, and Mr. Hartley graciously allowed me to review their documentation while maintaining the patronizing tone of an adult explaining complex matters to a confused child. Their research was thorough but selectively interpreted, focusing on any detail that could support their narrative, while ignoring evidence that contradicted their conclusions. The medical records they'd obtained showed Dorothy's regular doctor visits and cognitive assessments, but they'd highlighted only the portions that mentioned normal age-related changes in memory and decision-making. They'd ignored the sections that explicitly confirmed Dorothy's mental acuity and capacity for independent judgment right up until her final weeks. Similarly, their financial analysis focused on Dorothy's payments to Patricia Reeves and her visits to unfamiliar legal offices, but they'd overlooked the methodical planning and detailed documentation that characterized all of Dorothy's recent activities. They'd transformed evidence of Dorothy's careful preparation into proof of her confusion, and evidence of her protective secrecy into signs of undue influence. Linda watched me review their materials with the patient confidence of someone accustomed to overwhelming others with professional expertise and systematic documentation. "We understand this is a lot to process," she said gently, "but we hope you can see why these circumstances raise serious questions about whether Dorothy was truly free to make informed decisions about such significant matters." Mr. Hartley checked his expensive watch and adopted a tone of professional urgency. "We're prepared to file a formal challenge to the will by the end of this week, which would freeze all assets and require extensive legal proceedings to resolve. However, if you're willing to accept our settlement proposal, we can avoid that process and ensure that everyone's interests are protected without unnecessary conflict." The time pressure was clearly calculated to prevent me from seeking independent legal advice or fully understanding my options. They wanted a decision while I was still processing the shock of their accusations and the complexity of their evidence, before I could mount an effective defense or challenge their interpretation of Dorothy's actions. I set down their documents and looked directly at Linda, recognizing that she was the driving force behind this sophisticated attack on Dorothy's wishes. I need time to review this with my own attorney, I said, maintaining as much calm as I could manage despite the fury building in my chest. Dorothy's arrangements were made with full legal representation, and I won't make any decisions without understanding all my options. Linda's expression shifted slightly, revealing a flash of irritation beneath her professional composure. Of course you're free to seek legal counsel, she said, with forced pleasantness. But I hope you'll consider the emotional and financial costs of prolonged legal proceedings. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is accept difficult realities rather than fighting battles that ultimately harm everyone involved. Mr. Hartley gathered his documents and stood with the authoritative presence of someone accustomed to intimidating opponents through professional credentials and implied superior understanding. We'll give you 48 hours to consider our proposal, he said, handing me a business card with formal courtesy. After that, we'll have no choice but to proceed with formal legal challenges that will be far more expensive and traumatic for everyone. After they left, I sat alone in Dorothy's dining room, staring at the settlement papers they'd left behind and trying to process the calculated cruelty of their approach. They'd spent hours researching ways to undermine Dorothy's final wishes, constructing a narrative that portrayed her love for me as confusion, and her protective planning as evidence of manipulation. The sophistication of their attack made me realize that Linda's banking background had taught her exactly how to analyze financial records for signs of irregularity, and Mr. Hartley's legal expertise provided the framework to transform circumstantial evidence into seemingly compelling arguments for invalidating Dorothy's will. I called Patricia Reeves immediately, explaining Linda and Mark's visit and the accusations they'd made about Dorothy's mental capacity and my influence on her decision-making. Ms. Reeves listened without interrupting, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific claims they'd made or evidence they'd presented. This is exactly what Dorothy expected, Ms. Reeves said when I finished describing their presentation. She told me that Linda would likely use her banking connections to obtain financial records, and that they would try to characterize her careful planning as evidence of confusion or coercion. That's why she documented everything so thoroughly and involved multiple witnesses to her mental state and decision-making process. Ms. Reeves scheduled an emergency meeting for that afternoon, explaining that Dorothy had anticipated this exact scenario and had prepared comprehensive documentation to counter any claims about her cognitive capacity or autonomy. The evidence Dorothy had accumulated would not only defend the validity of her will, but would also demonstrate that Mark and Linda's assumptions about her wishes had been contradicted by her explicit instructions months before her death. When I arrived at Ms. Reeves's office, she had assembled a thick file of materials I hadn't seen before, including video recordings Dorothy had made explaining her reasoning for the life estate arrangement and her concerns about Mark's intentions regarding the house. Dorothy had also arranged for independent psychological evaluation to document her mental acuity, and she'd created a detailed timeline of Mark's pressure tactics and premature inheritance planning. Dorothy was a teacher for 40 years, Ms. Reeves reminded me as she organized the documentation. She knew how to anticipate challenges and prepare evidence to support her position. Everything Linda and Mark discovered about Dorothy's legal activities was exactly what Dorothy intended them to find, because she knew they would interpret normal planning activities as suspicious behavior. The video recordings were particularly powerful, showing Dorothy clearly and calmly explaining her decision to protect my housing security and her concerns about Mark's premature plans to sell the house. She spoke directly to the camera with the articulate precision of someone accustomed to explaining complex concepts to skeptical audiences, addressing every potential challenge to her reasoning and decision-making capacity. In one recording, Dorothy specifically discussed her awareness that family members might question her mental state or suggest that I had influenced her inappropriately. I want to be absolutely clear, she said, looking directly into the camera, that these arrangements reflect my own careful analysis of my family's behavior and my own values about how my legacy should be preserved. Sarah has been the most dedicated and loving family member I could have asked for, and these legal arrangements reflect my gratitude for her care and my confidence in her character. Ms. Reeves also showed me documentation of Dorothy's meetings with a geriatric psychiatrist who had evaluated her cognitive function and decision-making capacity just weeks before her death. The evaluation confirmed that Dorothy was mentally sharp, fully aware of her legal options, and capable of making complex decisions about her estate without any external pressure or influence. The penalty clause in Dorothy's will specifically addresses attempts to challenge her mental capacity, Ms. Reeves explained. If Mark and Linda proceed with their threats, they will automatically forfeit any claim to Dorothy's estate, which will then transfer entirely to the educational foundation Dorothy designated. They're essentially threatening to disinherit themselves if they follow through on their legal challenge. The comprehensive nature of Dorothy's preparation was both impressive and heartbreaking. She'd spent her final months not just arranging for my security, but building an impenetrable defense against her own family's greed and manipulation. She'd anticipated every argument they might make, every piece of evidence they might gather, and every legal strategy they might employ to override her actual wishes. Ms. Reeves prepared a formal response to Linda and Mark's settlement proposal, including copies of Dorothy's video statements, the psychiatric evaluation, and documentation of Mark's premature inheritance planning that contradicted his claims about honoring Dorothy's true wishes. The response made clear that any legal challenge would trigger the penalty clause and result in the complete loss of their inheritance rights. That evening, I reviewed all of Dorothy's documentation, including personal letters she'd written but never sent, detailing her growing concerns about Mark's financial pressure and his apparent assumption that her death would solve his own economic problems. The letters revealed that Dorothy had tried multiple times to discuss her actual wishes with Mark, but he'd consistently redirected their conversations toward his own plans for the property. One letter, dated just 6 weeks before Dorothy's death, was particularly revealing. Mark came by again today asking about the house deed and whether I'd considered, quote, simplifying things by transferring ownership to him while I'm still alive. He says it would save on taxes and legal complications, but I can see in his eyes that he's already planning what he'll do with the money from selling it. He doesn't understand that this house isn't just an asset to me. It's Sarah's home, the place where she's built a life while caring for me with more love and dedication than I ever received from my own children. Dorothy's private thoughts, preserved in letters she'd never intended anyone to read until after her death, provided the most damning evidence against Mark and Linda's characterization of her mental state and decision-making process. She'd been fully aware of their motivations, completely clear about her own priorities, and methodically determined to prevent them from destroying the stability she'd created for me. The next morning, I delivered Ms. Reeves's response to Linda and Mark, watching their confident expressions change as they realized the scope of evidence Dorothy had assembled against their claims. Linda's professional composure cracked as she read Dorothy's video statements, and Mark's face went pale when he encountered documentation of his own premature inheritance planning. Mr. Hartley reviewed the materials with increasing agitation, clearly recognizing that Dorothy's preparation had eliminated any viable legal challenge to her will. The psychiatric evaluation and video recordings made claims about her mental incapacity impossible to sustain. And the penalty clause meant that pursuing their threats would result in losing everything they hoped to gain. This changes the situation significantly, Mr. Hartley admitted, his earlier confidence replaced by professional caution. The documentation you've provided suggests that any legal challenge would be unlikely to succeed and could trigger consequences that would be detrimental to my client's interests. Linda stared at the video transcripts with an expression that mixed fury and disbelief. She planned all of this, she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. She deliberately deceived us about her intentions while documenting our private conversations and financial discussions. This isn't estate planning, it's entrapment. The accusation revealed exactly what Dorothy had predicted, that Linda and Mark would be more angry about being outmaneuvered than concerned about honoring Dorothy's actual wishes. They weren't upset that Dorothy had died. They were upset that she'd died without giving them what they expected to inherit. Mark remained silent throughout most of the meeting, occasionally glancing at me with an expression that seemed to combine resentment and grudging recognition. He built his post-funeral plans around assumptions about Dorothy's priorities that had proven completely wrong, and now he was facing the reality that his mother had trusted me more than she'd trusted him. Mr. Hartley gathered his materials and advised Linda and Mark that pursuing legal challenges would be, quote, inadvisable given the strength of the opposing documentation and the potential financial consequences. His professional assessment confirmed what Dorothy had intended, that her careful preparation would make any challenge too risky and expensive to pursue. After they left, I sat in Dorothy's living room, surrounded by the evidence of her love and protection, understanding finally the full scope of what she'd given me. She hadn't just provided housing security. She'd given me the power to stand up to family members who viewed her death as their opportunity and her love for me as an obstacle to their financial plans. The house felt different now, not just like a place I was allowed to live, but like a home that Dorothy had explicitly chosen to preserve for me, despite pressure from people who should have respected her autonomy and honored her wishes. Every piece of furniture, every photograph, every carefully tended plant represented not just Dorothy's life, but her determination that her legacy would be defined by love rather than greed. That evening, I called Mr. Chen to update him on the resolution of Mark and Linda's challenge, and he seemed relieved that Dorothy's planning had proven as effective as she'd hoped. She was very worried about them, he said quietly. Not just about what they would do to you, but about what their behavior revealed about the kind of people they had become. She loved them, but she didn't trust them, and she wanted to make sure love won over selfishness. As I prepared for bed in the house that was now legally and permanently my home, I felt a complex mixture of grief, gratitude, and determination. Dorothy had given me more than security. She'd given me a lesson about the difference between family relationships based on love and those based on expectation. She'd shown me that true protection sometimes requires careful planning rather than just good intentions, and that honoring someone's memory means respecting their actual wishes rather than assuming what those wishes should have been. The legal challenge was over, but the emotional impact would last much longer. Mark and Linda had revealed their true priorities, and their willingness to attack Dorothy's mental capacity and my character had permanently changed how I understood my place in this family. Dorothy's love had protected me from their manipulation, but it couldn't protect me from the knowledge of how quickly they'd been willing to sacrifice family relationships for financial gain. I spent the following weeks going through Dorothy's personal belongings, finding more letters and documents that revealed the depth of her concern about family dynamics and her determination to prevent her death from becoming an opportunity for others to profit from her love. She'd been planning not just for my security, but for the preservation of values she'd tried to instill in her children but had apparently failed to sustain. Among Dorothy's papers, I found draft letters to Mark and Linda that she'd written but never sent, expressing her disappointment about their premature inheritance planning and their assumption that family property should automatically transfer to them, regardless of her actual relationships or preferences. The letters were heartbreaking in their combination of maternal love and profound sadness about the people her children had become. One letter to Mark, dated 3 months before Dorothy's death, read, "I know you see this house as your inheritance, but I see it as Sarah's home. She has given me 3 years of companionship and care that you were never willing or able to provide. When I die, I want my legacy to be about love and gratitude, not about rewarding people for expectations they never earned through their actions." The letter to Linda was more direct. "Your banking expertise has taught you to analyze financial transactions, but it hasn't taught you to value relationships that can't be measured in dollars. Sarah's worth to me isn't calculated by inheritance law or family hierarchy. It's measured by her presence during difficult days, her willingness to make this house a home, and her understanding that love is demonstrated through daily choices, not legal documents." Reading Dorothy's private thoughts about her family helped me understand that my situation wasn't just about inheritance disputes or housing security. It was about fundamentally different values regarding family responsibility, love, and legacy. Dorothy had chosen to honor relationships built through care and commitment, rather than those assumed through blood and expectation, and she'd been willing to risk family conflict to protect those values. The confrontation with Mark and Linda had ended, but its resolution had clarified something important about my future in Riverside and my role in preserving Dorothy's memory. I wasn't just the beneficiary of her estate planning. I was the guardian of her values and the protector of the home where she'd chosen to invest her final years in building something meaningful, rather than just maintaining something traditional. As autumn deepened and the anniversary of Dorothy's death approached, I began to understand that her gift hadn't been just about providing me with housing security, but about teaching me that love sometimes requires the courage to make difficult choices that prioritize relationships over expectations, gratitude over entitlement, and protection over politeness. Dorothy had used her final months to create a legacy that reflected her actual values rather than her family's assumptions about what those values should be. 3 months after the legal confrontation with Mark and Linda, I discovered something that changed everything I thought I knew about Dorothy's final gift to me. While organizing her bedroom closet to donate clothes to the church charity drive, I found a small wooden box hidden behind her winter coats, secured with a combination lock that used my birthday as the code. Inside was a collection of items that revealed the true scope of Dorothy's planning and her understanding of what my future would really need. The box contained property deeds I'd never seen before, including ownership papers for the 3 rental properties downtown that Dorothy had apparently been managing quietly for years. There were also bank statements showing a separate account in my name that had been accumulating funds from rental income for the past 18 months, along with a detailed business plan Dorothy had written for expanding the properties into a sustainable income source that would support me indefinitely. But the most stunning discovery was a thick folder labeled Sarah's Education Fund that contained correspondence with the University of Ohio regarding a master's program in library science that Dorothy had been secretly arranging for me to attend. She'd not only secured my admission and full funding for the program, but had also negotiated with the university to allow me to complete most coursework remotely so I could continue living in Riverside while advancing my career. The folder included a personal letter from Dorothy explaining her vision for my future. "I know you've been content working at the local library, but I've watched you light up when you talk about rare book preservation and digital archiving. You have the mind for advanced study, and I want to make sure you have every opportunity to develop your potential without worrying about financial constraints or housing stability." Dorothy had apparently spent 2 years researching career opportunities in library science, identifying program requirements, and building relationships with university administrators who could facilitate my success. She'd even arranged for me to have access to the university's rare book collection for independent research projects, understanding that my passion for literary preservation could become the foundation for a meaningful career. The rental properties were Dorothy's masterstroke of long-term planning. She'd been quietly purchasing downtown buildings whenever they became available, renovating them with Tyler's construction services before he'd become focused on his own business ventures, and establishing a reliable income stream that would provide me with financial independence long after her death. The properties were all in excellent condition, fully occupied, and managed by a professional company that handled maintenance and tenant relations. The business plan Dorothy had developed showed her understanding that I would need more than just housing security to build a fulfilling life in Riverside. She'd calculated that the rental income, combined with my library salary and the advanced degree she'd arranged, would allow me to pursue academic interests, travel, and eventually establish my own consulting practice in historical document preservation. But perhaps most importantly, the box contained a final video recording that Dorothy had made just 1 week before her death, when she was already quite weak, but still determined to communicate something she felt I needed to understand. In the recording, she sat in her favorite chair, wearing the blue cardigan I'd given her for Christmas, speaking directly to the camera with the clarity and purpose that had characterized her entire teaching career. "Sarah," she began, her voice stronger than I'd heard it in weeks, "if you're watching this, then you've found the box and you're beginning to understand the full scope of what I've tried to arrange for you. I want you to know that every decision I've made has been based on my absolute confidence in your character, your intelligence, and your capacity to honor the trust I'm placing in you." Dorothy went on to explain that she'd been planning for my future since the day I'd moved into her house, recognizing that my dedication to her care represented the kind of selfless love that deserved to be rewarded with opportunity rather than just gratitude. She'd used her connections in education and her understanding of property investment to create a foundation that would support whatever path I chose to pursue. "I've given you security," she continued, "but I've also given you responsibility. These properties represent the savings of 40 years of teaching, and the rental income they generate should be used not just for your comfort, but for continuing the kind of educational support that has always been important to me. I hope you'll consider establishing a scholarship fund for students who demonstrate the same dedication to learning that you've shown throughout your life." The video revealed that Dorothy had been thinking not just about my immediate needs, but about the legacy I could build using the resources she'd provided. She'd envisioned me as someone who would eventually become a community leader, using my education and financial stability to support other young people who needed encouragement and opportunity. Dorothy's final words in the recording were both a blessing and a challenge. I know that Mark and Linda will never understand why I chose to invest in your future, rather than simply passing assets to my biological children. But I've learned that family isn't just about blood relationships. It's about who shows up when you need them, who invests in your well-being without expecting anything in return, and who demonstrates through their actions that they value your presence in their life. She paused, looking directly into the camera with eyes that held both affection and determination. You've been the daughter I never had, Sarah, and I want you to use these gifts to become the woman I know you're capable of being. Don't let anyone make you feel guilty for accepting what I've freely given, and don't let anyone convince you that you haven't earned every opportunity I've provided. The recording ended with Dorothy's familiar smile and a simple statement. Build something beautiful with what I've left you, and remember that love multiplies when it's shared rather than hoarded. I sat in Dorothy's bedroom, surrounded by the evidence of her comprehensive planning and her faith in my potential, understanding finally that she'd been preparing me not just to survive her death but to thrive in ways I'd never imagined possible. The house, the education, the rental properties, the business plan, they were all components of a carefully constructed foundation for a life that would honor her memory while fulfilling my own dreams. The next morning, I called Patricia Reeves to discuss the additional assets Dorothy had left me and to understand the legal implications of inheriting rental properties along with the house. Ms. Reeves seemed pleased but not surprised by my discoveries, explaining that Dorothy had mentioned additional provisions in her estate planning, but had wanted me to find them naturally rather than being overwhelmed by too much information at once. Dorothy was very strategic about timing, Ms. Reeves explained. She knew that if you'd understood the full extent of her gifts immediately after her death, you might have felt too burdened by responsibility to fully appreciate what she was trying to provide. She wanted you to first establish your right to the house and your ability to stand up to family pressure before revealing the larger opportunities she'd created. The rental properties were legally mine, with all necessary documentation properly executed and recorded. The education fund was administered through a trust that would cover not just my master's program, but potentially doctoral studies if I chose to pursue them. Dorothy had even arranged for me to have access to sabbatical funding that would allow me to take time off from work to focus on advanced research projects. Ms. Reeves also revealed that Dorothy had established a separate fund for community educational initiatives, with the provision that I would serve as the primary administrator once I completed my advanced degree. The fund was designed to support exactly the kind of scholarship program Dorothy had mentioned in her final video, creating a permanent legacy that would help other young people pursue educational opportunities they might not otherwise afford. She wanted you to have choices, Ms. Reeves concluded. Not just the choice to stay in Riverside, but the choice to leave if you wanted to, the choice to pursue advanced education, the choice to start your own business, and the choice to support other people's dreams the way she supported yours. I spent the following weeks processing the magnitude of Dorothy's gift and beginning to understand how I could honor her vision while pursuing my own interests. The master's program she'd arranged would begin the following fall, allowing me time to adjust to my new circumstances and prepare for the increased responsibilities that would come with advanced education and property management. The rental properties required minimal attention thanks to the professional management company Dorothy had employed, but I decided to visit each building and meet the tenants who were contributing to my financial security. The buildings were all in Riverside's historic downtown district, beautifully maintained and occupied by a mix of young professionals, retirees, and small business owners who appreciated the character and affordability of Dorothy's properties. Meeting the tenants helped me understand another dimension of Dorothy's legacy. She'd been a conscientious landlord who kept rents reasonable, responded quickly to maintenance requests, and created a sense of community among her renters. Several tenants told me stories about Dorothy's kindness, her willingness to work with people during financial difficulties, and her genuine interest in their lives and careers. One tenant, a young teacher named Maria Santos, explained that Dorothy had reduced her rent during her first year of teaching, understanding that new educators often struggle financially while establishing their careers. She said she remembered what it was like to be a young teacher, Maria told me, and she wanted to make sure I had affordable housing while I was getting started. Mrs. Mitchell saved my career by making it possible for me to stay in Riverside when I couldn't afford market-rate rent elsewhere. Another tenant, Robert Kim, had been allowed to modify his apartment to accommodate his elderly mother when she could no longer live independently. Dorothy had not only approved the modifications, but had helped arrange for accessibility improvements that made the space more comfortable for his mother's needs. She understood that housing isn't just about square footage, Robert explained. It's about creating spaces where people can live with dignity and maintain their connections to community. These conversations helped me understand that Dorothy's rental properties weren't just income generators. They were expressions of her values about education, community support, and compassionate treatment of people during vulnerable periods of their lives. Inheriting the properties meant accepting responsibility for continuing her approach to property management, using the income they generated to support not just my own goals but the broader community's well-being. I also discovered that Dorothy had been quietly supporting several community organizations through anonymous donations funded by rental income. She'd contributed to the library's Rare Book Preservation Fund, the local food bank's educational nutrition programs, and a scholarship fund for students whose parents worked in the service industry. These contributions had been made without fanfare or recognition, reflecting Dorothy's belief that community support should be driven by genuine concern rather than public acknowledgement. The scope of Dorothy's community involvement made me realize that she'd been preparing me not just to inherit her assets, but to continue her role as a quiet community leader who used financial resources to support educational and social initiatives that might not otherwise receive adequate funding. The rental properties provided the stable income stream that had made her charitable giving possible, and now they would allow me to continue that tradition while pursuing my own academic and professional goals. As I began my master's program in library science, I found that Dorothy's arrangements had created exactly the kind of flexibility and support that made advanced education both possible and enjoyable. The remote coursework allowed me to maintain my connection to Riverside while engaging with scholars and resources at the university, and the financial security provided by the rental properties meant I could focus on learning rather than worrying about student loans or living expenses. The program's focus on rare book preservation and digital archiving aligned perfectly with my interests and the resources available in Riverside. The town's historical society had an extensive collection of documents and photographs that needed professional attention, and my coursework provided the skills and knowledge necessary to begin preserving these materials for future generations. I also discovered that Dorothy had been corresponding with the Historical Society about my potential involvement in their preservation projects. Having recognized that my interests in literature and history could contribute to important community initiatives, she'd apparently suggested that the Society apply for grants to fund professional archival work, positioning me as someone who would eventually have the qualifications to lead such projects. The master's program also introduced me to other professionals in library science who shared my passion for literary preservation and community education. Through coursework and conferences, I began building relationships with scholars, librarians, and archivists who could provide ongoing support and collaboration as I developed my expertise in the field. One particularly meaningful connection was with Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a professor specializing in community-based archival projects who had known Dorothy through educational conferences years earlier. Dr. Harper explained that Dorothy had contacted her specifically to discuss my potential for graduate study and my interest in preserving local historical materials. Dorothy was very proud of your intellectual curiosity and your commitment to community service, Dr. Harper told me during one of our conversations. She felt that your combination of academic interests and practical experience made you ideal for the kind of work that bridges scholarly research and community engagement. Dr. Harper became a mentor who helped me understand how my academic work could contribute to Riverside's cultural preservation while also advancing my professional development. She encouraged me to pursue research projects that would benefit the local community while building my credentials for future career opportunities. By the end of my first year in the program, I had established a routine that balanced academic work, property management responsibilities, and community involvement in ways that felt sustainable and fulfilling. The rental properties provided financial stability, the education fund supported my intellectual growth, and the community connections Dorothy had fostered created opportunities for meaningful contribution to Riverside's cultural life. I also began implementing Dorothy's vision for expanded educational support by establishing the Dorothy Mitchell Scholarship Fund, which would provide assistance to local students pursuing careers in education, library science, or community service. The fund was supported by a portion of the rental income, as Dorothy had suggested, and administered through the community foundation she had quietly supported for years. The scholarship program became a way to honor Dorothy's memory, while continuing her commitment to educational opportunity. The first recipients were students who demonstrated the same kind of dedication to learning and community service that Dorothy had valued throughout her teaching career, and their success validated her belief that educational support could transform individual lives and strengthen community bonds. As I prepared for the final year of my master's program, I reflected on how completely Dorothy's planning had transformed my life, and my understanding of what was possible when someone invests in another person's potential with genuine love and strategic thinking. She'd given me not just security, but opportunity, not just resources, but responsibility, not just inheritance, but legacy. The house on Maple Street had become truly mine, not just legally, but emotionally, as I filled it with my own books, my own furniture, and my own memories, while maintaining the sense of warmth and welcome that Dorothy had cultivated throughout her life. The rental properties had taught me about responsible stewardship and community engagement, showing me how financial resources could be used to support other people's dreams and aspirations. The education Dorothy had arranged had opened doors I'd never imagined, connecting me with scholars, researchers, and practitioners who shared my interests and could support my continued growth in the field. The community connections she'd fostered had created opportunities for meaningful work that combined my academic training with practical contributions to Riverside's cultural preservation. Most importantly, Dorothy's example had taught me that true wealth consists not just in accumulating resources, but in using those resources to create opportunities for others and to build communities that support human flourishing. Her rental properties, her educational fund, her community donations, and her mentorship had all been expressions of a fundamental belief that love multiplies when it's shared, rather than hoarded. On the second anniversary of Dorothy's death, I hosted a small gathering in her honor at the house on Maple Street, inviting the tenants, scholarship recipients, library colleagues, and community members who had been touched by her generosity. The event wasn't a memorial service, but a celebration of ongoing life and continuing legacy, showing how Dorothy's gifts had created ripple effects that extended far beyond her immediate family. Mr. Chen attended the gathering, bringing photographs from his years of friendship with Dorothy and sharing stories about her quiet kindness and her concern for community well-being. Several scholarship recipients spoke about how Dorothy's support had made their education possible and how they planned to continue her tradition of community service in their own careers. Maria Santos, the young teacher who had benefited from Dorothy's reduced rent, announced that she had been accepted to a master's program in education and planned to focus on curriculum development for underserved communities. Robert Kim shared that his mother had passed away peacefully in the modified apartment Dorothy had helped create, surrounded by family and friends in a space that had allowed her to maintain her dignity and independence. The gathering demonstrated how Dorothy's strategic generosity had created a network of people committed to supporting each other and contributing to community well-being. Her rental properties had provided affordable housing, her educational support had enabled academic achievement, and her example had inspired others to think about how they could use their own resources and opportunities to help others. As the evening concluded, I stood in Dorothy's living room, surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by her generosity and who were now contributing to the kind of community she had envisioned. The house felt full of life and purpose, not as a monument to the past, but as a foundation for ongoing growth and contribution. I realized that Dorothy's final gift hadn't been just financial security or educational opportunity, but a model for how to live a life that creates value for others while pursuing personal fulfillment. She had shown me that inheritance isn't just about receiving assets, but about accepting responsibility for using those assets to build something meaningful and lasting. The confrontation with Mark and Linda had revealed their understanding of inheritance as entitlement based on family relationships and legal precedent. But Dorothy's actual legacy demonstrated a different approach, one based on earned trust, demonstrated commitment, and shared values about how resources should be used to support human flourishing. As I prepared for bed in the house that had become my permanent home, I thought about Dorothy's final video message and her challenge to, quote, build something beautiful with what she had left me. The rental properties, the education fund, the community connections, and the scholarship program were all components of that beautiful construction. But the most important element was the understanding that love and generosity create more value than accumulation and self-protection. Dorothy had transformed my life, not just by providing security and opportunity, but by teaching me that true wealth consists in the ability to support other people's dreams and to create communities where everyone has the chance to develop their potential. Her legacy lived not in the properties she had owned or the money she had accumulated, but in the lives she had touched and the opportunities she had created for others to flourish. The house on Maple Street stood as a testament to the power of strategic love and thoughtful generosity, showing how one person's careful planning could create ripple effects that would benefit the community for generations to come. Dorothy's gift had been more than inheritance. It had been an invitation to participate in the ongoing work of building a world where love multiplies through action rather than diminishing through hoarding. Mark and Linda had never understood that Dorothy's true legacy wasn't about family hierarchy or financial accumulation, but about creating opportunities for others to thrive and contribute to community well-being. Their attempt to claim her assets had revealed their misunderstanding of what she had actually been trying to accomplish through her careful planning and strategic generosity. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt grateful not just for the security and opportunity Dorothy had provided, but for the model she had given me for how to live a life that creates value for others while pursuing personal fulfillment. Her legacy would continue through the scholarship recipients, the tenants in her properties, the community organizations she had supported, and the example she had set for using resources to build something beautiful and lasting. The knock came at my door on a rainy Thursday morning in November, exactly 6 months after Dorothy's funeral. Through the peephole, I could see a man in a dark suit holding an official-looking envelope, and my heart immediately began racing with the kind of anxiety that had become familiar whenever unexpected visitors appeared. The legal battle with Mark and Linda had ended months ago, but the experience had left me hyper-vigilant about anyone who might represent new challenges to the stability Dorothy had worked so hard to create for me. The man introduced himself as Thomas Whitfield from Riverside County Records Office, and his presence seemed both official and apologetic as he explained the reason for his visit. "Ms. Mitchell," he began, shifting uncomfortably on the front porch while rain dripped from the roof overhang, "I'm here regarding some irregularities we've discovered in property records that may affect your inheritance. There are documents that need your immediate attention, and I'm afraid the situation is more complicated than your attorney may have realized." The word irregularities sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the November weather. I invited Mr. Whitfield inside, offering him coffee while trying to maintain outward calm despite the internal panic that was building with each passing moment. The legal documents Dorothy had left me were supposed to be ironclad, carefully prepared to withstand any challenge, and the idea that new complications had emerged felt like a betrayal of everything we'd fought to protect. Mr. Whitfield opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder containing what appeared to be historical property records, survey maps, and correspondence between various government offices. "The issue," he explained, spreading the documents across Dorothy's dining room table, "involves the original survey of this property from 1952, when the city boundaries were redrawn following the post-war expansion. It appears there was an error in the property lines that has only recently been discovered during our digitization project." My stomach dropped as I realized he was suggesting that there might be problems with the actual ownership of Dorothy's house, the foundation of everything she'd planned for my future. The documents he showed me included survey maps that seemed to indicate the property boundaries were different from what had been recorded in more recent deeds, potentially affecting not just the house but the large garden area that had been Dorothy's pride and joy. "According to these original records," Mr. Whitfield continued, pointing to specific sections of the survey maps, "approximately 1/3 of what you believe to be your property actually belongs to the adjacent parcel, which has been owned by the Chen family since 1968. Additionally, there appears to be a utility easement running through the center of the property that was never properly recorded in subsequent deed transfers." The implications of what he was describing began to sink in with horrible clarity. If the property boundaries were incorrect, Dorothy's careful estate planning might be meaningless because she hadn't actually owned everything she'd thought she was leaving to me. The house itself might be secure, but the gardens, the garage, and the backyard where Dorothy had spent countless hours cultivating flowers and vegetables might belong to someone else entirely. Mr. Whitfield seemed to sense my distress and adopted a more sympathetic tone as he continued his explanation. "I want to assure you that we're not here to challenge your right to live in the house," he said gently. "The structure itself is clearly within the correct property boundaries. However, the boundary discrepancies need to be resolved before any future transactions can take place, and there may be financial implications regarding property taxes that have been calculated incorrectly for decades." He handed me a notice that required my response within 30 days, explaining that the county was obligated to correct the property records, and that all affected parties would need to participate in a formal boundary resolution process. The notice also mentioned potential tax adjustments, legal fees, and the possibility that some structures on the property might need to be relocated if they were found to be encroaching on neighboring land. After Mr. Whitfield left, I sat alone in Dorothy's kitchen, staring at the official documents and trying to process this new threat to the security she'd worked so hard to provide. The irony was bitter. Dorothy had anticipated family challenges, legal disputes, and financial complications, but she couldn't have predicted that the government itself would discover errors that predated her ownership of the property by decades. I called Patricia Reeves immediately, explaining the county's visit and the boundary issues they'd identified. Ms. Reeves listened carefully to my description of the documents and Mr. Whitfield's explanations, asking detailed questions about the specific claims and the timeline for resolution. Her responses suggested this was a more serious situation than Mr. Whitfield had indicated, and that the implications could extend far beyond simple boundary adjustments. "Property boundary disputes can be extremely complex," Ms. Reeves explained during our phone conversation, "especially when they involve historical survey errors and multiple decades of transactions based on incorrect information. The good news is that your right to the house itself seems secure, but we'll need to investigate whether Dorothy's estate planning accounted for these kinds of title issues." Ms. Reeves scheduled an emergency meeting for the following day, asking me to bring all of Dorothy's property-related documents along with the materials Mr. Whitfield had provided. She also suggested that we might need to hire a surveyor and potentially a title insurance specialist to fully understand the scope of the problem and our options for resolution. That evening, I walked through Dorothy's gardens with a new sense of uncertainty, wondering if the flower beds she'd tended so carefully, the vegetable plots where she'd taught me to grow tomatoes and herbs, and the mature fruit trees that provided apples and pears each fall might not actually belong to the property I'd inherited. The possibility that these spaces might be claimed by someone else felt like losing Dorothy all over again, since the gardens represented so much of her personality and our shared experiences. I also worried about Mr. Chen, Dorothy's longtime neighbor and friend, who apparently owned land that extended further onto what I'd considered my property than either of us had realized. The survey error wasn't his fault, but resolving the boundary issues might require negotiations or legal proceedings that could damage the friendship Dorothy had valued, and that I hoped to continue. The next morning's meeting with Ms. Reeves brought both relief and additional complications. After reviewing all the documents, she confirmed that the house itself was definitely within the correct property boundaries, and that my inheritance rights to the structure were not in question. However, the garden areas and some outbuildings were indeed located on land that belonged to the Chen property according to the original 1952 survey. The situation is complicated by the fact that both properties have been maintained and improved based on the incorrect boundary information for over 70 years, Ms. Reeves explained. Your grandmother invested thousands of dollars in landscaping and garden development on land she believed she owned, while Mr. Chen has been paying property taxes on areas he's never used or maintained. Ms. Reeves outlined several potential solutions, ranging from purchasing the disputed land from Mr. Chen to negotiating a formal boundary adjustment that would reflect the current use patterns rather than the original survey lines. She also mentioned the possibility of adverse possession claims, since Dorothy had openly maintained the garden areas for decades without challenge from the Chen family. However, each potential solution carried risks and costs that Dorothy's estate planning hadn't anticipated. Purchasing additional land would require funds that might not be available. Boundary adjustments would require county approval and expensive legal procedures, and adverse possession claims could take years to resolve and might damage relationships with neighbors who had been Dorothy's friends. The most important thing, Ms. Reeves concluded, is to maintain open communication with Mr. Chen and avoid letting this become an adversarial situation. Given his friendship with Dorothy and his role in protecting her final wishes, he may be willing to work with us on a solution that preserves both the property arrangements and the neighborly relationships Dorothy valued. I decided to speak with Mr. Chen directly before pursuing any formal legal action, hoping that the friendship and trust Dorothy had built with him over the years might provide a foundation for resolving the boundary issues amicably. The conversation felt delicate because I needed to explain a situation that could potentially benefit him financially while asking for his cooperation in protecting my ability to maintain Dorothy's gardens. Mr. Chen invited me into his living room, the same space where he'd first shown me Dorothy's letter and helped me understand the scope of her planning. His expression grew concerned as I explained the county's discovery and the potential boundary issues, but he listened without interruption until I described the full situation and its implications for both of our properties. I suspected there might be survey problems years ago, Mr. Chen said after I'd finished explaining the county's findings. Dorothy and I sometimes wondered why the property lines seemed different from what we could see in the yard arrangements, but neither of us thought it was important enough to investigate. We were neighbors and friends, not people trying to gain advantages from each other. His response immediately eased some of my anxiety about the situation. Mr. Chen's focus on friendship rather than property rights suggested he might be willing to work together on a solution, rather than viewing the boundary error as an opportunity for financial gain at my expense. Mr. Chen walked to his desk and retrieved a folder I hadn't seen before, containing what appeared to be correspondence and documents related to his own property ownership. When Dorothy first told me about her estate planning concerns, he explained, I became more interested in understanding property rights and legal protections. I've been researching the history of both our properties, and I found some information that might be relevant to this situation. The documents he showed me included historical records of the original property development, correspondence with previous owners, and what appeared to be informal agreements between neighbors about garden maintenance and shared use of certain areas. Most intriguingly, there was a letter from Dorothy to Mr. Chen's late wife, written over 15 years ago, discussing their mutual interest in maintaining the gardens and their informal understanding about property care. Dorothy wrote this when my wife was still alive, Mr. Chen explained, showing me the letter dated 2008. She was concerned that future property owners might not understand the collaborative approach we'd developed for maintaining our yards and gardens. She wanted to document our friendship and our shared commitment to keeping the neighborhood beautiful. The letter revealed that Dorothy and the Chen family had been consciously collaborating on property maintenance for years, with Dorothy caring for gardens that technically belonged to Mr. Chen's land, while the Chens maintained trees and landscaping that extended onto Dorothy's property. Their approach had been based on practical considerations and mutual respect, rather than strict adherence to property lines neither family had reason to question. Your grandmother was always thinking ahead, Mr. Chen continued, and she understood that good neighbors create more value than strict property boundaries. She cared about maintaining beauty and community relationships more than claiming every square foot of land she might technically own. Mr. Chen's historical perspective helped me understand that Dorothy's approach to property had always been collaborative rather than possessive, focused on creating and maintaining beauty rather than maximizing individual ownership rights. The boundary error wasn't undermining her intentions. It was revealing the extent to which her values prioritized community cooperation over individual property claims. Over the next several days, Mr. Chen and I worked together to document the current state of both properties, photographing gardens, measuring structures, and creating a detailed record of how the land had been used and maintained over the years. The collaborative approach felt like honoring Dorothy's memory, while addressing the practical needs created by the county's discovery of the survey error. We also discovered that the utility easement Mr. Whitfield had mentioned was largely theoretical, involving underground infrastructure that didn't interfere with current property use but would need to be acknowledged in any future construction or major landscaping projects. The easement actually simplified some aspects of the boundary resolution because it provided a clear framework for shared access and maintenance responsibilities. Mr. Chen proposed a solution that reflected both practical considerations and the collaborative values Dorothy had modeled throughout her life. Instead of trying to enforce the technical property boundaries or negotiate complex land purchases, he suggested that we formalize the informal arrangements Dorothy and his family had maintained for years, through a shared use agreement that would allow both properties to continue functioning as they had, while acknowledging the correct legal boundaries. We could create a formal garden cooperative, Mr. Chen explained, where you continue maintaining the areas Dorothy cared for, while I continue caring for the sections my family has always managed. The legal ownership would reflect the correct survey boundaries, but the practical use would continue the collaborative approach your grandmother established. The garden cooperative concept appealed to me both because it solved the immediate boundary problems and because it honored Dorothy's values about community cooperation and shared responsibility for maintaining beauty. The arrangement would allow me to continue caring for Dorothy's beloved flower beds and vegetable gardens while acknowledging Mr. Chen's legal ownership of the land and his family's contribution to the neighborhood's character. Ms. Reeves reviewed Mr. Chen's proposal and confirmed that a formal shared use agreement could resolve the boundary issues while protecting both parties' interests and avoiding expensive legal proceedings. The agreement would need to be recorded with the county and included in the property deeds, but it could be structured to allow both families to continue their established patterns of property care and maintenance. The legal documentation process took several weeks, but it proceeded smoothly because both Mr. Chen and I were committed to finding a solution that honored Dorothy's memory, while addressing the county's requirements for accurate property records. The shared use agreement we developed became a model for how neighbors could collaborate on property maintenance while respecting legal boundaries and individual ownership rights. During the legal preparation process, I discovered additional information about Dorothy's property planning that revealed she had actually anticipated potential boundary issues and had included provisions in her estate documents for resolving such complications. Among her papers, Ms. Reeves found notes indicating that Dorothy had researched property survey history and had been aware that some boundaries in the neighborhood might not reflect the original legal descriptions. Dorothy had apparently consulted with a surveyor years earlier as part of her comprehensive estate planning, and the surveyor had mentioned the possibility of historical errors in the property records. Dorothy's notes indicated that she'd been prepared to address boundary issues if they arose, and she'd even set aside funds specifically for property-related legal expenses that might be necessary to protect my inheritance. Your grandmother thought of everything, Ms. Reeves marveled as we reviewed Dorothy's property-related documentation. She knew that protecting your inheritance might require more than just careful will preparation, and she wanted to ensure that unexpected complications wouldn't undermine your security or force you to make decisions based on financial constraints rather than your actual preferences. The fund Dorothy had established for property-related expenses was sufficient to cover all the legal costs associated with resolving the boundary issues and creating the shared use agreement with Mr. Chen. Once again, Dorothy's careful planning had anticipated challenges I couldn't have imagined and had provided resources to address those challenges without compromising my financial stability or forcing me to make desperate choices. The formal signing of the shared use agreement took place in Ms. Reeves's office on a sunny December morning, with both Mr. Chen and me feeling satisfied that we'd found a solution that honored our respective property rights while maintaining the collaborative approach to neighborhood care that Dorothy and his family had established over the years. Mr. Chen brought a small gift to the signing ceremony, a framed photograph of Dorothy and his late wife working together in the gardens, taken during the summer of 2015 when both women had been collaborating on a particularly ambitious flower bed design. The photograph captured the spirit of cooperation and mutual respect that had characterized their friendship and that our legal agreement was designed to preserve for the future. Dorothy would be pleased that her planning protected your inheritance while also strengthening the neighborly relationships she valued, Mr. Chen said as we concluded the legal proceedings. She always believed that the best solutions were ones that created benefits for everyone involved, rather than advantages for some people at others' expense. The resolution of the boundary issues marked the end of a challenging period, but also the beginning of a new phase in my relationship with Dorothy's legacy. The property was now legally secure, the gardens could continue to flourish under collaborative care, and the neighborly relationships Dorothy had cultivated were formally protected through legal agreements that acknowledged both practical cooperation and individual ownership rights. As winter settled over Riverside, I found myself appreciating Dorothy's gift in new ways. She hadn't just provided me with housing and financial security. She'd given me a model for how to address unexpected challenges through collaboration rather than conflict, community engagement rather than individual defensiveness, and creative problem-solving rather than rigid adherence to formal rules. The boundary resolution had also strengthened my relationship with Mr. Chen, transforming him from Dorothy's friend, who'd helped me understand her intentions, into my own neighbor and collaborative partner in maintaining the beauty Dorothy had created. Our shared use agreement had become the foundation for an ongoing friendship that honored Dorothy's memory, while creating new opportunities for community cooperation. The experience had taught me that Dorothy's legacy wasn't just about the specific assets she'd left me, but about the values and approaches she'd modeled for addressing life's inevitable complications. Her careful planning had provided resources for resolving unexpected problems, but more importantly, her example had shown me how to approach challenges with creativity, generosity, and commitment to solutions that benefit everyone involved. As the first anniversary of the boundary resolution approached, I organized a small celebration in Dorothy's gardens, inviting Mr. Chen and other neighbors who had been part of Dorothy's community of mutual support and care. The event wasn't just about commemorating the legal agreement we'd reached, but about celebrating the ongoing life and beauty that collaborative care had made possible. The gardens had flourished under our shared maintenance, with new flower varieties complementing Dorothy's established plantings and expanded vegetable areas providing fresh produce for several neighborhood families. Mr. Chen had contributed expertise about soil management and plant selection that had enhanced the garden's productivity, while I had maintained Dorothy's careful attention to seasonal planning and aesthetic design. During the celebration, several neighbors shared stories about Dorothy's influence on the community and her approach to problem-solving that prioritized relationships over individual advantages. The stories revealed that Dorothy's collaborative approach to the boundary situation was consistent with how she'd addressed other neighborhood challenges over the years, always seeking solutions that strengthened community bonds rather than creating winners and losers. One neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who lived across the street, recalled how Dorothy had helped resolve a drainage problem that affected several properties by organizing a collaborative solution that distributed costs and benefits fairly among all the affected homeowners. Another neighbor, the Thompson family, described how Dorothy had mediated a dispute about tree maintenance that could have damaged relationships between longtime friends, but instead became an opportunity for establishing ongoing cooperation. These stories helped me understand that Dorothy's gift to me wasn't just personal inheritance, but initiation into a community approach to problem-solving that created value for everyone involved. The boundary resolution had been an opportunity to demonstrate my commitment to Dorothy's values, while addressing practical challenges that could have undermined the security she'd worked to provide. As the evening celebration concluded, Mr. Chen and I walked through the gardens together, admiring the winter preparations we'd made collaboratively, and planning the spring plantings that would continue Dorothy's tradition of creating beauty that enhanced the entire neighborhood. The legal agreement that had resolved our boundary issues had become the foundation for an ongoing partnership that honored Dorothy's memory, while creating new opportunities for community enhancement. The experience had transformed my understanding of inheritance from something passive that I'd received into something active that I was continuing to create through my choices and actions. Dorothy's legacy lived not just in the property and resources she'd left me, but in the values and approaches I was using to build relationships and address challenges in ways that created benefits for my broader community. Standing in Dorothy's gardens on that winter evening, surrounded by the evidence of collaborative care and community cooperation, I felt grateful not just for the security Dorothy had provided, but for the model she'd given me for living a life that creates value for others while pursuing personal fulfillment. Her gift had been more than financial inheritance. It had been an invitation to participate in the ongoing work of building communities where everyone has opportunities to flourish. The boundary resolution had confirmed that Dorothy's planning was about more than protecting my individual interests. It was about ensuring that her values would continue to influence the community she'd loved and served throughout her life. The shared use agreement, the collaborative gardens, and the neighborly relationships we'd strengthened were all expressions of Dorothy's belief that true security comes from building connections with others rather than defending individual territories. As I prepared to go inside that evening, I touched the memorial stone Mr. Chen and I had placed in the garden to honor Dorothy's memory and her vision for collaborative community care. The stone was engraved with words from one of Dorothy's favorite poems. "What we plant in the soil of contemplation, we shall reap in the harvest of action." The inscription captured Dorothy's understanding that thoughtful planning and generous action could create legacies that benefit entire communities rather than just individual families. The boundary resolution had been one harvest from Dorothy's careful contemplation and planning. But I knew there would be others as I continued to implement her vision for using resources to create opportunities for others, and to build communities where love multiplies through shared action, rather than diminishing through individual hoarding. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.